All right, so folks, we're going to talk about chapter one from your textbook today. Sometimes I'll have you take notes. Today is not the day. You do not have to take any notes. If you really want to, in your forensics notebook after the bad impressions lab, you are welcome to. The text in blue is what is most important. So, if you tell someone that you are taking a forensic science class, some might mistake that for speech and debate. And that just has to do with the Latin root, but it's not uncommon for forensics to be another word for speech and debate. So, I shorten it quite often because I'm lazy. We really should be saying forensic science. And folks usually just associate that with looking at evidence related to a criminal case. And criminal cases are offenses against the state. Someone's broken the law, and it may include crimes against a person or organization. But the evidence standard is quite high for criminal cases, not so much in civil cases. And that is a dispute between two individuals. Usually, a contract has been broken. The loser may have to give property or payment. But evidence can be important in both criminal and civil cases. So, the three facets of guilt, if you are a prosecuting attorney, your hope is that you can prove the means, the motive, and the opportunity to get a guilty verdict. Let's say a couple that's known to have a pretty tumultuous relationship goes away on a remote vacation and the man is strangled to death. We might first think, well, that girlfriend is looking pretty guilty. But then we come to find out that he is a defensive lineman on the Niners, and his girlfriend is a 5'1", very petite cheerleader. So motive is there. Maybe she's jealous. They're known to fight. The opportunity is there. They were away together on vacation, but it'd be pretty hard to prove that this petite woman could strangle such a large football player. You don't have to have a motive, but it certainly helps your trial. But sometimes it's just unknown. So, depending on the crime lab, the services can vary greatly. Our Santa Clara County Crime Lab has a wide variety of services beyond these basic services, but in other areas, crime labs may have to send out their evidence to other more comprehensive labs. So the system's pretty fragmented. There's no organization between the national, the state, and the local levels, and that has proven to be problematic. We'll talk about that in a minute. But in terms of the 5 major federal labs, can you guess which is the oldest law enforcement agency? It is the United States Postal Service. So in 1775, Benjamin Franklin named the first post office inspector, and William Goddard's job was to investigate and arrest anyone who stole or interfered with the mail. And back then, it was usually the innkeeper who collected the mail or the mail carrier. And Congress made mail theft a capital crime in 1972. Typically, people don't think of the Postal Service. However, they were the ones that just arrested Steve Bannon, one of Trump's early advisors. He and 2 other men have been charged with defrauding individuals. They said 100% of the funds that these individuals gave would go towards building the border wall, and in fact, they took a lot of money. So currently, the USPS has over 2,400 law enforcement officers, and they investigate things. Think of what gets sent in the mail: narcotics, um, child porn, bombs. Basically, if there's a scenario where someone's been defrauded and mail is part of that process, then the USPS can come in. FBI, though, maintains the largest crime lab in the world. That came to be in 1932. J. Edgar Hoover really supported the use of science to help with investigations. He was the director of the Bureau of Investigation. The FBI is now in Quantico, Virginia. The DEA, that came around in 1973 as a result of Nixon. Alcohol, tobacco, firearms. Actually, I don't have a year for that one. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're mainly a conservation group, but they do investigate the illegal or illicit trade of animal parts and products. It's about a $3 billion industry annually. So they are important as well. So like I mentioned, it's pretty fragmented. Here's an example of where we could benefit with more communication between these organizations. Arthur Shawcross is a known serial killer. He murdered 2 children in his hometown, and he only served 12 of the 25 years, which is a pretty short sentence for killing 2 children. But he moved to Rochester, and no one knew that he moved, and he later went on to kill 11 more women. So it's not a perfect system. When I post these slides, there is this link here. You can see the labs that we have just in California. We have quite a few, but the local levels are important as well. All right, so why has forensics sort of taken off? Back in the 60s, the Supreme Court realized we needed to emphasize more science when investigating crimes and rely less on eyewitnesses. We'll talk more about how that's problematic. Crime rates were also increasing. We had more evidence to study. And then really the big game changer was the advent or the invention of DNA profiling. We could do fingerprints, we could do blood typing, but really DNA is what catapulted the system. I'm going to let you folks do a little more research on history with some resources I provide you later. But I do want to mention sort of the father of forensics, Edmund Locard. So he is referred to as the Sherlock Holmes of France. He basically said, hey, every contact leaves a trace, and it's up to us to find those trace contacts. So the Locard exchange principle is sort of the founding principle of forensics, is trying to find even the most minute evidence that might have been left behind. So lots of background here. Like I said, I'll give you time to sort of learn more about this at another point. So this is a science class. Not surprisingly, we are talking about the scientific method. Now, that slide there says, as it pertains to criminalistics, you can use the word criminalist and forensic scientist interchangeably. If we want to get really technical, we should talk about the area of forensics, and the criminalist is who analyzes all the different types of evidence. But like I said, they're sort of used interchangeably. Forensic scientists need to ideally reconstruct the events that left the evidence where it was. So these complex reasoning skills are quite important. The forensic scientist's role, though, is not just looking at the evidence. So this is A here, analysis of physical evidence. Here's where the scientific method comes in, but also knowing the constraints of the judicial system and the best way to prepare that evidence. Cordelia Willis at the Santa Clara Crime Lab has been a criminalist for 19 years. And, you know, in the TV shows, the forensic scientists are out in the field all the time. But she only goes to about 2 crime scenes a year. She's in the lab the rest of the time. And of all of the crime scenes she's been to, only 2 were not murder. So this is a major part of the role, is being in the lab looking at that evidence. However, they also act as expert witnesses. They will go to court and give their expert testimony, which is an opinion. They did not see what happened and how that evidence was left there, so they are allowed to give their opinion as to what they think happened. And then lastly, because they are not going to crime scenes very often, they have to make sure those that are on site can recognize relevant evidence, collect it, and get it back to the lab in the same shape that they found it. So they also train law enforcement. So when we look at what can be presented in court, as I mentioned, criminal cases have much more stringent requirements. But we say that the evidence has to be probative. It has to actually prove something. So perhaps a prosecuting attorney might mention a previous criminal record of the person on trial. They want to sway the jury to make them think that this person is criminal minded. The judge can decide if that can remain as evidence. Perhaps the defense will object to that. Evidence also has to be material. If someone is guilty of burglary and they ran into a store and stole something, and the prosecuting attorney brings up the case that they have a .38 caliber handgun, but there was no gun involved in the crime, that would not be allowed because it's not actually relevant to the case. So, two big court cases play a role in what sort of evidence can be used. And the first was back in 1923, Fry versus the United States. There was a man, James Fry, who was convicted of second-degree murder, and he appealed his conviction and wanted to bring in a polygraph to prove that he did not commit the murder. He had initially confessed to the crime and then later retracted it because he said he was pressured. And they would not allow him to bring in the polygraph. The polygraph is the lie detector test. And with this ruling, it set precedent. The judge said the scientific community as a whole needs to know what test or what evidence you're discussing. And at the time, the polygraph was pretty unknown. And this Fry standard has remained for some time. So new techniques, new tests, novel experimentation is often not allowed because it's just too brand new, and that can be pretty problematic. So in 1993, Daubert versus Dow, I'm going to back up. There was a medicine developed in the 50s called Benedictine, and Merrill Dow Pharmaceutical was the company that made it. The medicine had been given to people to stop nausea, often to women who were pregnant, who had morning sickness. And in the 70s, many lawsuits came forth that showed that Benedictine was causing birth defects in these pregnant women, even though the FDA had said that it was safe. And there were some new tests to prove that there was risk. And at that point, the judge said, we need to kind of ease up on these rules. We need to allow new experiments, new tests to be brought into court. And so now that gave the trial judge the decision, will these novel tests be allowed? So you'd think that everybody probably would have switched to Daubert, but you can see on this map here, there is a mix. Is the Fry standard used, or is that overturned by Daubert? The states in blue are, they have their own system for evidence admissibility. All right, so the last thing to quickly talk about is time of death. We'll talk about different jobs that a forensic scientist may hold, one of them being a pathologist. But one thing that's important for a trial that would perhaps involve a murder is knowing when the individual died. So this is the job of the pathologist, and there are a variety of ways in which this can be determined. So one of them, which many people have heard of, is rigor mortis, right? How is the body in terms of rigidity? And it's not a permanent thing. When somebody dies, we can look at their body temperature. And you can see here that maybe you find a body that's stiff and warm or a body that's stiff and cold. And that would give you a different indication as to when they died. And that stiffness has to do with the lack of ATP. If you guys remember, that's the cell's energy currency. If there is no ATP being made, then these interactions between the actin and myosin filaments are locked in place. And eventually, the interaction will begin to break down and the rigidity goes away. Livor mortis, or sometimes called lividity, has to do with the blood settling due to gravity. So if this man was found clothed, at first glance, investigators might have thought he died on his side. But you can see that the body had been moved based on the marks left on his back due to the pooling of the blood. So lividity is usually pretty set after about 10 to 15 hours after death. So if a body is moved before that time period, you may not see any of those marks. Algor mortis is the cooling of the body after death, and obviously a wide variety of factors could affect that. Is the person wearing clothing? What is the time of year? Is the clothing dry? Um, is the person very heavy with a lot of extra body fat? Was it in the day? Was it in the night? So on average, we say the body cools about one degree to 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit for every hour. So if you take the temperature of the body and work backwards, you can determine a range. So no one would ever say this person was killed at 10:19 p.m., but with these varieties of ways to look at time of death, you could have a pretty good guess. So that is it for the chapter 1 lecture. If you haven't already corrected your study guide for our test Friday, that is the other screencast you want to watch. Send me an email if you have any questions.